Probably not.
Why does it keep rolling back like that?
Okay.
This is a stable platform. We're still too far away. Put your chairs together like that at 90 degrees, and then you're close enough that it almost looks like television. See, when people are actually doing television interviews, they're like this, and the camera is here, and that's how they make it look.
Sounds very kind of problematic, the relations that people have on television.
Oh, absolutely.
Anyway, I want to welcome Vinay Gupta for the first of a series of Aston Conversations. These conversations are very directly inspired, and I wish to acknowledge that by the Vasteras conversations that Dugald began to hold in May, June this year.
Keep talking.
So Dugald ran these conversations which really tried to create a new kind of public conversation. Rather than have lectures, he would sit down with people and have really interesting conversations, a bit like the ones that one has after dinner or at a really good dinner party. And I think this is what at least I'm trying to achieve here. I'm doing this in collaboration also with Steve Lawson, who's known online as Solar Bass Steve. And we're going to do a conversation next week like that. But today we're going to launch with Vinay, whom I've known now for 3 or 4 years, via Dugald originally. I think I met him in London when Dugald was giving a talk, and Vinay started heckling him rather publicly.
That sounds about right.
And ever since then, we've become quite good friends, although we don't always agree. In fact, we sometimes disagree quite vehemently, which is quite fun.
Christopher, your microphone is your camera, your tripod is drunk.
My tripod is drunk.
So I think I fixed it.
Okay, well, let's hope it's not.
I don't. Do continue.
So what we want to talk about today is infrastructure in the broad sense. This is a subject that interests me very much from a number of perspectives. I have a student here, Oscar, who's studying disasters and flood responses, and that's very much to do with the way society builds its infrastructure in the broad sense, not just physical infrastructure like flood defenses or railways or water systems. But what interests me is also the broader sense of infrastructure in terms of the whole systems that our society and our civilization depends upon. Mm-hmm. So first of all, it might be a good idea to talk a little bit about what your relationship with this infrastructure, why you're interested in, and how you understand what infrastructure is about.
Well, so my story is one of awful happenstance, right? 2002, some awful person at Rocky Mountain Institute asks me whether I can make a disaster shelter that can be packed flat and put back onto a truck. And I say, how hard can that be? And go off and invent the Hexia, 20 minutes later. And at that point, I've gotten saddled with having made something which is genuinely useful. Right? Up until that point, no real interest in environmentalism, no real interest in green issues. I happened to be at Rocky Mountain Institute because it was a job. And I wanted to do something useful for the world, but I had not picked that, right? It was just a series of coincidences. Once I got saddled with the bloody Hexia, the series of questions that begin to kick in, once you say, we can mass produce super cheap housing, how do we do everything else, right? Becomes a kind of unfolding question, right? Because there's no simple answer to how do we take care of people or what do human beings need. So as soon as you become personally interested in the question of what do human beings need, how do you provide for people in the millions and tens of millions, you see how this is kind of an open-ended question. So for several years, I absorbed the infrastructure modeling stuff from Rocky Mountain Institute, but it was designed for doing energy policy analysis rather than for doing humanitarian infrastructure or humanitarian need meeting. Right? And so I had to kind of chew that to pieces and then reintegrate it. And then we got simple critical infrastructure maps. And then from there came stacktivism. And, it's this series of progressions down the path of this very big question.
So what is infrastructure for you?
Well, what infrastructure is for me has changed over time. Right. So initially, I absorbed the Rocky Mountain Institute model, which is infrastructure is the pipes and wires that go into people's houses.
Right.
Right? And it wasn't until I asked why
Mm.
that became at all useful, you see? Like in a disaster relief context, understanding that you're using natural gas in a cylinder rather than natural gas in a pipe as a way of feeding people doesn't really tell you what infrastructure is. It just tells you, here's a working system, now make substitutions where you go from pipe and wire services to containerized services. Make sure you've got one of everything in the box, you'll be fine.
Right.
Right? So there's no story about what infrastructure is there, there's just a picture of it.
Okay.
Right? So I developed SCIM, Simple Critical Infrastructure Maps, in 2007,
Mm.
2008, something like that. And that starts with this sudden flash of realization that the purpose of infrastructure is to keep you alive.
Right.
Right? That's its
Which
ultimate
is
function.
various people have said various versions of that, but fundamentally infrastructure is what keeps us alive.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. For me, once it crystallized out, the way that it hit, because I was interested in disaster stuff, was 6 ways to die. Right? So not the complex, nebulous sense of like infrastructure as a supported structure, but here are 6 epidemiological risks which infrastructure is a mechanism to minimize.
So this is abstracting away from the physical manifestation of infrastructure to the actual function of infrastructure.
Exactly.
The 6 ways to die were
Too hot, too cold, hunger, thirst, illness, injury.
and that remains the 6 ways to die.
We have not yet found a 7th.
Okay.
I mean, people will occasionally say boredom, but I tend to think of that as being injury.
Well, there's a theory that loneliness is another way to die.
Yeah, loneliness is a tricky one. At the risk of making an inappropriate joke, how many potatoes does it take to kill an Irishman?
I don't know.
None.
Okay.
So modeling deficits is actually quite difficult, right? Like, for example, hunger is a lack of, right? Whereas injury is the presence of. And one of the things which is never quite settled in the infrastructure modeling language is there a clear and consistent way of discussing the difference between lacks and events? There's an epistemological problem at the root.
We'll come back to this thing of loneliness because I'd want to add to this concept of infrastructure at a later point. But you said your view of infrastructure changed. So it changed from the Rocky Mountain pipes and physical infrastructure to the more abstract SCIM model. How did it progress after that?
So next thing that comes out of 6 ways to die is, what about communication?
Right.
So once you think about communication, you realize that communication is typically a 3-person or 3-entity event, right? Alice, Bob, and something that relays messages.
Right.
Could be radio, could be internet.
The classic cryptographic model of communication.
Right. And that thing in the middle, that medium, is typically not politically neutral.
Okay.
So
but here we're stepping fast into another perspective on infrastructure.
Well, right. And because you've got something like a refugee camp, getting communication pipes into a refugee camp is highly politically controversial. Right? Because actually not everybody involved in the refugee business wants the refugees to be sitting there streaming on YouTube.
Just as what kind of shelter you offer the refugees is also politically controversial, hence the whole problem of whether to use tents or whether not to use hexa units.
Hard-sided shelters, yada yada, the whole story. The notion that how I understand infrastructure changes over time, right? This is what I mean about when you pick a really hard question, the answers that you have are necessarily sequential. So you have one model of reality now, you apply that model, it turns out not to correspond exactly with reality, you learn some more. So there's a necessity to accept that the models are all partial and continuously modifying, which is something that we are very allergic to in political theory.
Yes, well, all models are wrong, some are useful.
You see, right? But when you talk to people about their political ideologies, they always want to tell you that they have a static analysis, which is the answer.
And which is universally true through time and space.
You see what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
So scientific method gave us a methodology for learning, which is probably going to remain universally true, right? Barring certain classes of discoveries, it's likely the scientific method is a permanent discovery, in the same way that the mathematical method is a permanent discovery.
Okay.
Right? What we're not very good at is having political entities which have a mechanism of learning which is static, but a surface of results which is continuously changing.
Can you explain that further?
Okay, so if science was a body of results, but we didn't have a scientific method, then we would only add to that body of results in a haphazard way, and what was in the body of results would be hotly contested. Right?
Right.
Instead, what we have is a method for science, and it's agreed that if you follow the method, the results will be true within the certain parameters.
Yes, except things shift all the time.
Well, absolutely, right? And they have to shift all the time. But the method doesn't actually change.
No.
Right? So we agree on things like
in theory.
We agree on things like repeatable experiment, and we go from there. What we don't have is any political movements which have a set of principles that are equivalent in scope to repeatable experiment, followed by a wavefront of discovery.
Well, that fits in with people's need for permanence and constancy. And in a certain sense, what politics tries to offer people is a certain sense of security.
They want to know what you believe, not what you've learned.
Right.
Because if you're learning, you might change your mind, and then what happens if you believe something you don't believe anymore?
So then one can't be sure that you will do what you say, even though we all know that politicians don't do what they say.
You know, I promised to do this thing, but I've since discovered that it will kill everybody. Maybe we should do something else. Oh, you're going back on your word, we'll never re-elect you.
Exactly.
Well, I could push the button if you prefer. Right? So that notion that we don't have politics which are about learning and discovery is really part of the reason that I'm framing this notion of infrastructure as being a continual learning experience where I reframe and reframe and reframe.
Okay, so let's go back then to the communication as infrastructure. We are more and more frequently talking about things like the internet as part of infrastructure. And there is a, let's say, simplistic way of looking at it, that more and more of the things that we depend to live on are controlled through the internet.
Absolutely.
So things like our electricity system. I attended a talk last year. Actually, it was one where you were as well, about the dangers of our electricity system being hacked, and it could very easily collapse just by accessing it via the internet.
Absolutely.
So there's that simplistic layer where the communications technology that we're using becomes, we depend upon it to keep ourselves alive.
Absolutely.
But it goes a bit further than that, I think.
I mean, it was really hard to kill people with a telephone call. Right? Like,
Yes.
I mean, in theory, if you called, say, a doctor,
Yes.
you might be able to give them bad information that would cause them to accidentally kill a patient.
Yes, but there was no systematic manner of doing that.
It was really difficult, right? As you put more and more and more stuff on the internet, the ability to just reach out and kill people with software goes up and up and up and up and up.
Whether purposefully or by accident.
Oh, absolutely, right? Self-driving cars, for example. You know, I mean, imagine if some bastard hacked self-driving cars and then ran them all into pedestrians.
Okay.
Right? It's a perfectly imaginable kind of software exploit.
At which point we start talking about things like the Internet of Things and smart cities, which depend exactly on a level of automation, both in buildings, cars, transport systems, and so on and so forth, which potentially could be wonderful, but potentially could be awful.
I saw somebody say recently, I'm trying to remember who, went by on Twitter, that sufficiently advanced sort of Internet of Things or smart city stuff is indistinguishable from being haunted.
Yes, I think that's a lovely idea. Somebody elsewhere is controlling it, and you don't know who, and you can't see, and that sort of thing.
Imagine if some teenage brat, you know, hacks your Internet of Things house and just constantly makes things slightly annoying.
But we will use very strong security, and we will have fantastic access control, and everything will function very thoroughly, and it'll be tested, and so your average teenager will not be able to hack.
You know, if they could do that, why do we still have spam?
Well, exactly.
Right? Why do we still have viruses? Why do we, you know, Windows PCs need virus checkers? Right?
Okay.
Android phones getting hacked with things that lift your bank details when you're trying to do mobile banking and then send them directly to Azerbaijan. Right?
So that's an inevitable feature of an infrastructure. We're going to become more and more dependent upon an information technology mediated infrastructure, and we're going to become more and more vulnerable to the dangers of such a fragile system.
Look, if they can't secure banking and they can't secure credit cards, why the hell would they bother securing thermostats? Right? You could argue that we've never had a plane get hacked. Right? On the other hand, there are a relatively limited number of planes. Right? They're far off, they're far away, they're kind of weird to get physical access to. I have a suspicion that we're going to discover cars are really a lot more vulnerable than planes are.
Well, also planes historically have not been actually directly connected while in flight to the information technology, the ICT system.
You see what I'm saying, right?
So, at 30,000 feet above the air, you can't actually log into the plane.
In theory. And so, the joke about the 747 is basically the world's largest Sun workstation.
Well, that may speak something about Sun OS as being rather secure.
Yeah, possibly, we would hope, right? But, once you fill the world with self-driving cars, the amount of access that a hacker can get to a car, right? You could sit there with a car for as long as it takes to find an entry point.
So why is there this rush headlong to instrumenting so many parts of our lives in such a vulnerable manner? What's the fundamental drive? That all these gadgets are nice and shiny?
Because people are stupid monkeys.
Okay,
right?
But unpack that. I mean,
right.
Fine. That's a generic statement.
There's an old book called "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy. Why Isn't It Working?"
Yeah.
Right? Freud's original vision for psychotherapy was that you would wind up with saner rulers and therefore better quality of life for ordinary people, because rather than their political leaders being nuts, they would gradually become saner over time.
Okay.
And these guys basically sat down and said, we're really old psychotherapists. We kind of thought it was going to make a difference, and it's obviously not working. And you could point to Nixon and Clinton and a few others.
Right.
Who was that guy that got shot down in France for the scandal with the maid?
Oh, yes, Strauss-Kahn.
Yeah. Right. These people are all clearly barking mad. Right.
Well, hardly the most barking mad.
Hardly the most barking mad, but it's an example of the fact that the political leadership are still basically subject to the full range of Freudian neuroses.
Okay. So what's your point?
So these guys sit down, and two things in that book, which I read when I was a teenager, have stayed with them permanently. One of them is the idea that human beings automatically adopt any technology which makes the world seem more magical.
Okay, so that's my claim about it being nice and shiny, and
it goes.
You're beyond, immediately.
It goes
attracted.
beyond nice and shiny, right?
Yeah.
What people love is technologies which make the world more dreamlike.
Okay.
Right? Intrusions of this kind of dreamlike fluidity into reality. Any technology that does that is almost automatically going to be adopted by the market. Right? So think of the simple utility of electronic locks that actually worked. Right? We could have gone to electronic locks. Every lock in the world could be, at least door locks, could be a big hunk of electronics with a 9-digit passcode. You could generate one-use codes, and you could text them to your friends. Right? It'd be fantastically useful. There's nothing at all romantic or magical about it. Nobody wants it. Right? Because it's got the quality of making the world harder rather than more liquid.
Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Whereas,
although in some countries electronic locks are much more popular than others.
Well, they are slowly catching on,
yeah.
But they haven't had that immediate, whereas the cell phone is telepathy in a bag. Right?
Okay.
It's the bloody Star Trek communicator made real. The iPad, it's the Star Trek slates made real. Right? We can't have the teleporter, but you can have the communicator.
But I've always thought that part of the success of computer science and information technology has to do with the fact that it's always reducing effort. And there's a kind of inherent belief that people are lazy or wish to be lazy, even though I don't believe that to be actually the case. And so one's always promoting this technology. Oh, it'll be easier for you.
The labor saving story.
It's the labor saving kind of thing.
I don't think that labor saving is remotely the driver. I think it is magic seeking that is the driver. Right? We just love spectacle and wonder. It's what we are.
Let me turn the conversation slightly, because one of the things that I want to get back to is the politics behind this infrastructure. I mean, obviously we're seeing a seamless continuation of the physical infrastructure, whether it was aqueducts produced by the Romans to transport systems to information technology, and this is now we're sort of bleeding into the Internet of Things and smart cities. There is an inherent political dimension here.
Well, absolutely, right. So let's think about the third turning, right? First exposure to infrastructure for me is Rocky Mountain Institute, pipes and wires. The political context of that is, why don't we fix the engineering of the pipe and wire system so that we don't kill the climate?
Right.
Right. So the political model at Rocky Mountain Institute is all about coal lobby, oil lobby, bad engineering baked into safety regulations on cars. Why can't we make a 300 kilogram electric car that runs on solar panels? Answer is coal people, oil people, car safety people to collectively mandate a 2,000 kilogram hunk of steel. And you can't fix the engineering problem to reduce global warming because the car legislation won't let you. That's the political framing that goes with the pipe and wire model.
Right.
So then we come along a little further, 6 ways to die model. 6 ways to die model turns into critical infrastructure maps. The political map that goes with that is, well, how could we get the UN to ship water filters rather than bottled water? How can we get them to ship solar panels and LED flashlights rather than kerosene lanterns? Right. So the political context around the infrastructure changes as I learn more and the model changes. Right? And one model is layered on top of the other, they're not exclusive. Then I do this talk in spring of 2009, Ben Vickers' temporary school of thought kind of teaching workshop thing called Infrastructure for Anarchists. And that talk is kind of the inception point, right? It's the seminal moment of redefining infrastructure around the idea of long-term political development in a manner which would be recognizable to Marxists. Right?
Explain that a little bit more.
So the question that I ask at that point is, right, to whose advantage is this infrastructure provided? Right? The electricity company operates the electrical grid for the benefit of the electricity company. And once you realize that the infrastructure is not politically neutral, that it's all about a series of things which are being bought and sold relative to society and even illicit radical monopolies and all the rest of this kind of stuff, you begin to realize that the infrastructure harness is actually just an extension of capitalism, or it's an extension of state socialism. Most of the infrastructure which is provided for by the state is an extension of the will of the state. The infrastructure that's provided by the market is the extension of the will of the market. Right? And all of the infrastructure that we use on a day-to-day basis is an extension of the will of either the state or the market.
Yes, but that's somehow inherent in the definition of infrastructure. If you go back in history, all the classical examples of infrastructure have always been expressions of the state, if you like, in a benevolent manner, looking after the population.
Well,
I put that in quotes.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a yes and a no, right? So most of the people throughout history lived with no infrastructure at all. Right?
Okay.
Infrastructure was, you might have a well at a village level. Other than that, people, crapped in their middens and ate the food that grew on their land. And the vast majority of their infrastructure needs were directly drawn from nature in the form of ecosystem services. So, hang on.
Yeah.
So if you're a peasant living in an agricultural settlement and you have no need for infrastructure because you get water from the river, food from the soil, stored heat in the form of wood to cook on, at that point, there is no relationship between you and other human beings on the infrastructure pathway.
Okay,
right?
fair enough.
You plus nature equals everything you need, and you have a condition of autarky. As long as you have land, you have life.
Okay.
Now, that is a kind of state of nature for humans. If you've got land, you've got life, was almost
relatively stable societies that lasted for long periods of time.
It's pretty much axiomatically true from the start of evolution right up to probably the invention of farming. Right? Somewhere between the invention of fire and the invention of farming, we begin to get complex societies, we begin to get division of labor, and you begin to have a social long tail attached to your survival needs. And as you come out of simple society where you're an ecosystem service, where you're connected to power structures or markets or things like that, you begin to discover that your ability to survive is now deeply entangled with a whole bunch of stuff that you don't control.
Yes, I mean, I think it's Paul Raven who's said that basically we've been kind of what's the term? Cyber.
That we went from being a collective of cyborgs at the point where we were chasing things with spears, to being a cyber collective at the point where we had cities.
Exactly, and so we're always dependent upon extensions of ourselves in terms of tools and infrastructure.
Extended phenotype covers very nicely.
But I don't know that.
Extended phenotype? So the extended phenotype of a wasp is a wasp nest.
Okay.
A termite is a termite mound. A human being, it's a city.
Right. But at that point, then, when you say, it's always an extension of the state or of the capitalist system,
well, or whatever political structure you have around that,
then we need to look at that a little bit, because it becomes almost meaningless. It becomes inherent to the species, if you like, that there is infrastructure that we are dependent upon.
Yep. Well,
it's got nothing.
It's relative to our ecosystem niche. So right now, the ecosystem niche of an average human being is that they are 90% dependent for their survival on other human beings and only 5 or 10% on nature. Right?
Well, they're indirectly dependent on nature.
They're indirectly dependent on nature, but you wind up with an enormously large number of people between you and nature.
Yes.
Right? And that enormous number of people between you and nature are sitting there, and every single one of them has their hand on the choke point that controls your life support structures.
And they're taking resources away along that path.
They provide you with economic efficiency, but they also deprive you of freedom.
And they take away the actual resources in forms, in various forms, because they are their function is to provide that economic efficiency, but in the process they're siphoning off a certain percentage for themselves to justify their existence.
Well, I mean, they justify their existence by taking 1 unit of stuff, turning it into 2 units of stuff, and then keeping half a unit for themselves.
Fair enough.
Right. I mean, I sell you efficiency and take a cut.
So what is meant by stacktivism? This is a movement that really...
We can't get to stacktivism yet. Right?
We can't get to stacktivism yet?
No, because what we have to look at is infrastructure for anarchists.
Okay.
Right? So infrastructure for anarchists posits this notion that every kind of infrastructure that you put into a system has political agency attached to it.
Right. Okay.
And that you cannot have an anarchist revolution, that you can't have any kind of a revolution until you've figured out how to create structures which maintain and create more physical infrastructure to keep people alive. And this is the super critical point, right?
For anarchy.
For any kind of political change. If you can't manage the critical infrastructure through your transitional process, you're not going anywhere. Point 1.
Okay.
Point 2, tons of that infrastructure are under the control of people that you're not. So you have the revolutionary free state of Sark Island, right? Mm-hmm. And if the boats stop coming with food, Sark immediately runs out of food.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So you only have the ability to do political change to the extent structure, or you could continue to draw on infrastructure services from other people.
And that means also that if you are connected up to a wider network beyond your borders, you'll become totally dependent.
Which is where we all are now.
So
take an island like, not an island, but take a city-state like Singapore, right? If Singapore is suddenly taken over by, let's pick something improbable, Trekkies, right?
Yeah.
The new government of Singapore decides that Star Trek is going to be the state religion, and everybody starts dressing in uniforms, and the whole thing looks completely bananas from the outside world. Even if they're still technically going to continue to deliver their contracts, in all probability their economy will collapse because other people are just like, that's too weird, right? We're not really comfortable putting this much money into a country run by Star Trek fanatics.
That raises a completely different issue there.
No, right? Because their ability to do political self-determination is heavily determined by whether or not the market will continue to deal with them after they've gone through the transformation.
Okay,
Right.
we've seen that on a series of events in the past 50 years where some power or another has disagreed with a political change in the country and has, I mean, Chile, the attempts to destabilize Venezuela, or Bolivia, all those sort of things are examples.
I'm not talking just about violent intrusion. What I'm talking about is people withdrawing their willingness to trade in a manner which is very much like a kind of unofficial embargo.
Right.
So we're in a position where, for example, Greece could easily have kicked into a completely new political equilibrium. Iceland could have kicked into a completely new political equilibrium. But the question is, if they had gone over, would people have still traded with them?
Well, in a capitalist economy, why wouldn't they?
Well,
there's always somebody who's prepared to trade.
But maybe at such an enormous discount, you no longer have an economy.
Possibly.
Right. Now, reconnect this around to the critical infrastructure story, right? If you are dependent on importing your oil, your gas, your food, your medicines, and all the rest of these things, you can't have internal political change that the people buying and selling from you think is too weird.
Okay.
So, as a result, the notion that you could do some kind of high-tech anarchist micro-state and that you could have very high standard of living and very low resource consumption with high social harmony and long life, right, high welfare, right, tons of human development on a very little amount of software and a very small amount of natural resources, right? I'm pretty sure that's possible, but if you try it, then try and figure out how you're going to buy your birth control pills, right?
Yes. This leads back to your general critique of, for example, Transition Town, in that they have not addressed where do they get the insulin from in
all of that
collapse scenario.
I mean, they will wave herbs in your face and tell you they're great for diabetes, but at the end of the day, show me the vaccines. So, infrastructure for anarchists challenges the people that are interested in radical politics to say, tell me how your radical politics covers, right? Pipe and wire infrastructure to keep people warm, right? Supply chain stuff to keep them in insulin and all the rest of this kind of stuff, and governance and financing of these assets, right?
The problem with raising that question is you're inevitably pointing to, I mean, in a globalized world,
yes,
with a global economy, with a highly interconnected situation for almost every country, over time, you're leading to an enormous homogenization of political systems and approaches to economics. We certainly see that in economic terms.
Are you sure? Because it seems like there's an unlimited amount of space to the right, right? You can go right and further right than that. I mean, you could go all the way right and then some, and nobody bats an eyelid. If you go slightly left, slightly anarchist, or slightly funny, everybody freaks out.
And why is that?
I think it's because the world is run by bastards.
Okay, that's the conclusion for this evening.
That's a simple, right? So, right, we get to infrastructure for anarchists. Infrastructure for anarchists is static analysis looking forward.
Okay.
Right? All of this infrastructure has a political tail. All of this stuff is put here by people. Unless you can do their jobs, you're not going to get very far overthrowing them. Right? Have the entire weight of critical infrastructure management, supply chain management back on your shoulders, lads. If you are serious about changing the world, tell me about the toilets. Infrastructure for anarchists. That then begins to bounce around inside of the kind of London New Left. And at a certain point, Jay Springer is like, you know what? What? Right? We could take the entire history of Marxist analysis of production and the material base, and we could apply it to critical infrastructure. And this is a very clever thing, right? Because my work had always been focused on looking forward and dealing with crisis. So it's tended to either be fairy tales about the future or static analysis. Jay comes along and looks backward, right? Actually, Victorian plumbing rests on Victorian political assumptions because they had an infrastructure state, Joe Goldie's concept. And the coal stuff comes from over here, and here's the political, historical tale of the oil industry. And all of a sudden, there's this historical reading of infrastructure in the material base, which is basically a Marxist analysis in the material base without carting along the Marxist solutions of socialism. So you get this new focus on the economy, right? Marx is really only talking about the factory, and Jay comes along and kind of does like, okay, well, what if Marx also talked about the toilets? And this turns out to be a real kind of Swiss Army can opener, because it turns out that when you do that analysis, it peels open political space in very radical ways.
For example?
Well, so think of the Romans. What are the Romans famous for? Roads.
And aqueducts.
Roads and aqueducts. Ta-da! Right, let's have a stacktivist analysis of Rome, right? The roads turn out to be there for short-range transit.
Okay.
Right? So
for long range as well.
They'll have a settlement. They will build 50 miles of road in every direction around the settlement for moving agricultural goods, and then the long-range transit is mainly boats, right?
Well, they had long-range roads across the land as well, and
Which
it
were
was
for-
crucially
which were
for moving
Troops. Bingo.
That
right?
was the
So the economic base ran on boats, and the military base ran on troops.
Yeah.
Right. And the military base ran on roads.
Mm.
Right. So the troops went backwards and forwards on this kind of internet of spears, and the boats then carried all the heavy stuff around, because it's really hard to move heavy stuff.
above all,
cars.
they carried grain from Egypt to Rome. That was the kind of
That's
core
right. It's
activity.
the and, right? And then the aqueducts give you the ability to run your cities. Right. No aqueduct, no city. So from that we learn that the sort of political economy of the Roman system was basically three pieces of infrastructure that 2,000 years later we can name off the top of our heads. When you ask the same question about the modern world, right, we know tons about the relationship between the Roman state and the Roman aqueduct. We don't really think so hard about the relationship between the municipality of London and the municipality of London's reservoirs in up towards North London. We haven't really thought about plumbing very seriously, apart from when they blow up, a sewer. Right?
Well, that's got to do with the characteristic of infrastructure that it disappears.
Right?
When it works, it is
It
invisible.
becomes invisible because it's not magical
Right.
at all, apart from the first one. So when you take this kind of stacktivist analysis, right, we look at the history of all the deals done to put oil into play, right? Right the way through the American oil boom, then all the stuff in Saudi Arabia, the relationship with the car companies. And what you begin to see is that there's this enormous lurking tower of crap right in the heart of our economy that has huge political tails associated with it, that nobody is really understanding is a relationship between this awful political horror and the critical infrastructure systems. And that breakthrough in like, wait a minute, that's one problem, not two, and you can take the classical Marxist historical analysis or even the anarchist historical analysis and apply it not to the factory but to the bloody pipeline. This is stacktivism.
Right.
And that as a perspective is bouncing around in new left circles. It raises a lot more questions than answers.
Well, yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting analytical tool, but
Yeah.
that doesn't actually give us any leverage on the way the system is moving at the moment.
And this is the part of the process which I'm a bit like impatient with. You know, like I think stacktivism.
You still want to save the world.
Well, I sort of started. I gave up on saving it a while ago. I'm willing to rule the wreckage. So the stacktivist analysis, right, is an analysis. To turn it into actual forward motion, the question then is, well, what's the simplest thing you can do that might possibly work?
Okay.
Or how do you affect systemic change? Either question is good, right? But it's not clear what you do with stacktivist analysis other than set up villages, right?
You mean independent spaces?
Well, I mean, if you're going to do, if you're going to do infrastructure for anarchists, the idea is that you would have an anarchic, what's the word I'm looking for? An anarchic, not conclave. Enclave, community. Damn it, there's a word. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So you'd have basically an anarchist commune, simple, an anarchist commune that would provide for all of its own infrastructure needs in a way that was consistent with the organizational structures of anarchy. So you don't have an Eloy class that sits there painting and a Morlock class that sits there doing plumbing.
Going back to your comment about the right, we're not seeing those kind of communes exist, but we are seeing these free enterprise zones, which represent the kind of extreme dismantling of rules and regulations.
I am all about free enterprise zones.
Right?
I think they're fantastically useful. No, because look, in the long run, the problem that we have is that the nation state is basically stuck in the dim and distant past. Fundamental assumptions. Look, how long have we
I'm all in
had?
favour of the nation state.
how long have we had 4-year elections? 200 years? 300 years?
In Britain, yes, 200 years.
So over that time period, the news cycle has gone from being days to being seconds. And we're still only voting once every 4 years, right? There's a guy in London called David Boville who goes around with this placard, and the placard has 12 X's on it. And all it says is, this is a lifetime's worth of input to the democratic process.
Okay.
Right? Pretty obvious where that goes, right? It is really, really, really clear that we fixed on a democratic form that was advanced technology 200 years ago, and it has now turned into this ossified monster at the centre of society, because there's so much reliance on 4-year democracy that nobody can even question whether it's still perfect.
Yes, but you're taking a very idealistic view of these free zones. I mean, in reality, they are zones where, you know, in the Middle East or in Singapore or places like that, where it doesn't have more democracy. If anything, it's got less.
Right, but once you've got that form well established, I don't see any reason why you couldn't get special enterprise zoning for example, advanced ecological societies that would break the code that says you have to have a 2-ton steel car and let people experiment with the 300 kilogram plastic solar.
So this is a kind of what do they call these gated communities? It's a kind of Islington gated community on a large scale.
Well, look, we need test beds for ecological transformation.
Okay.
Right? We need places where you don't have building codes, you don't have product legislation in the current form, where you can basically leapfrog over all of the enormously slow and corrupt and decadent processes of conventional government and go directly to...
This is where I'm not...
And go directly to, inside of this 100 kilometre by 100 kilometre square, Amory Lovins writes the environmental legislation.
Yes,
right?
but
no, hang on, wait. Actually think about that as a potential.
Okay.
Right? We take 100 kilometre by 100 kilometre square and we put Amory in charge of all the engineering legislation. I can't think of a better way of saving the world. I need 100 kilometre by 100 kilometre square where we can demo that all of this stuff works and then export the know-how to the rest of the planet.
Okay, but you've made a big assumption. You've made a big assumption that you appoint Amory, who is a particularly positive force in the world, to set the rules.
Depends who you ask. I'm sure most of these things are run by basically Stalin or what's the name of the guy from American Psycho?
I don't know.
You know what I'm saying, right? I mean, I'm sure most of them are run by the Hannibal Lecter gods of capitalism, right? But I only need one.
One that looks like Amory.
I need one special enterprise zone in which we have this kind of green experiment, and we don't have to deal with building codes, and we don't have to deal with all the legacy
I
stuff.
don't think this is going to work, because these enterprise zones are really expressions of special forms of the state where it withdraws under certain conditions. And it's the state that's setting those conditions beforehand.
But I don't see any reason why a poor country wouldn't be willing to cut a deal with a bunch of rich American Greens to do a special economic zone with Amory in charge.
Because the rich American Greens are not likely to choose Amory. They're going to say, we will impose some form of libertarianism.
No. And rich American Greens, not rich American libertarians.
Well, how far are they away from one another?
Well, they're different camps. The Greens are communitarian granola munchers.
And they're rich?
Some of them are, one or two. You only need one or two, right?
I think you're being very idealistic.
No, I'm being very pragmatic, right?
Okay.
At the end of the day, yes, for the most part, special enterprise zones are about taking bastards and giving them more political power, right? But once you establish that kind of form, it becomes usable by people who are not bastards.
Okay, but then one of the things you pointed out earlier on in this conversation was the way these kind of infrastructures become universal elements.
Which kind of infrastructures?
So infrastructures, well, actually, this was a previous conversation we had. So examples of infrastructures that have become outside the control of the state, things that are more associated with standards, things like containerization, or the internet and telephony are established externally to the state. So the issue becomes then, when you take that a step further and you look at organizations like the World Trade Organization, how do you create a free zone that doesn't have all these non-state actors telling you, well, you have to do it like this and you have to do it like that, and these are the rules that you have to abide by. Otherwise, we're not allowing any economic interaction to the outside world.
So, I mean, that is an
that goes
question.
back to the issue of, if you've got your what is it, Star Trekky free enterprise zone, will anybody actually trade with it?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I guess we should talk about the glass ceiling for democracy first. Right? So there's a glass ceiling on democracy, which is the nation state. Right? You can have democracy right up until you get to the nation state, one human being, one vote, and then you hit this absolute wall above which there is only the anarchy of the states. Right? And then you get bodies like the UN. Well, yeah, everybody has a seat in the UN and everybody can vote, but you get one representative for the whole of China in the same way that you get one representative for the whole of Sweden. Right? So the notion that individual human beings contribute their weight to the democratic decision-making at the UN level is completely annihilated. You have the magical entity called a nation state, and if you have one, you get a seat, and if you don't have one, you don't get a seat. And what is this entity? It's a weird construct, right? I mean, Westphalia is a crazy thing, right?
But I agree with all that, but I think it puts in question the possibility of these free zones.
Well, so you get this glass ceiling for democracy, right? On the other side of the glass ceiling for democracy, you have this wall of weird stuff, right? International Telecommunication Union, World Bank,
World Trade Organization,
World Trade, right? The international,
ISO.
Right? ISO is a fantastic example, right? The world falls apart without it. I have no idea how it's governed. Right?
Well, it has a bunch of
magic. Right? It works so well, we don't care how it works. It's infrastructure. So once you get this notion that above the glass ceiling for democracy, there's this anarchic chaos of international organizations that are essentially drawing their legitimacy out of thin air, right? It becomes really clear why we can't get anything done politically.
Yeah.
Because you could vote all you like, but your nation state is surrounded by these weird international bodies, and unless you're one of the nuclear or economic superpowers,
who can say, I don't care,
right? The American approach to the internet, right? Then you have no ability for your democratic processes to have any influence at that level, right? So, in 2007, I decided that I was going to be an individual with a foreign policy. I was going to regard myself as being a single-person state, and my interface with the nations of the world was going to be by treaty rather than by citizenship. And that was largely a framework of mind.
Yes. But sounds very arrogant to me.
Well, I mean, look, I went out and got myself something that was equivalent to a nuclear deterrent. I went out there and, formed what amounted to treaties. I really took a damn good shot at dealing with myself as a one-man state. And, moderately successful. I think the next step is to become a one-man international organization. Right? Sovereignty, it turns out, doesn't actually get me everything that I want. So I think the next step is to figure out how to be a one-man IGO.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've gone from...
That's not going to happen.
Well, it's a conversation which can go on endlessly, and I'd like to at least give the opportunity to the audience to ask some questions. We've gone from physical infrastructure to various types of extensions of the infrastructure. We've seen how this, particularly the non-state actors, provide a very, very strong constraint on what's possible within the state.
Particularly for small states.
And you have this idea that potentially within free zones one could experiment at least with alternative models. And I would argue that that's highly constrained by these non-state actors.
Well, I mean,
one of the issues we have here is that everything looks like it's locking tighter and tighter. It's becoming more and more sclerotic. We fetishize innovation.
The NSA turning the entire internet into a single giant eyeball.
Okay,
not what you want for innovation.
No, we fetishize innovation in our society, and yet the reality is that we're making it more and more difficult to actually develop alternative models and try them out.
Yeah, I mean,
fundamentally alternative models. I don't mean
it's not the 60s anymore, right? We had Paris 68. Everybody decided that was a little close to the bone, and they've locked everything since.
And it's getting locked down tighter and tighter, I would argue.
Well, I mean, the old powers are locking it as fast as they can. On the other side of the world, technology is setting the entire thing on fire. So
I don't think technology can bring about miraculous change. I think there are other layers.
steam engines.
Steam engine didn't change the relationship between political power, for example.
Oh, sure did.
In what way?
Well, it made America possible. Right? And you couldn't have continental integration without steam engines.
Okay.
So America without steam engines would have been 50 countries.
You had China for a long, long time as an integrated space the size of the United States without steam engines.
Canals.
Yes.
And China. Right.
Roman Empire ran on roads. It was
but I mean,
could-
huge delegation of responsibility to the edges, huge regionalism.
and a lot of integration. The cultural influences that spread across the Roman Empire.
But not at a command and control level. Right? Those countries were
Softer, perhaps.
they were still culturally independent countries, even if they were parts of Rome. You were from Gaul in a way that is much stronger than being from Alabama.
Yes, inevitably, because time was slower in those days.
And the acceleration of time is driven by technological change.
Okay, let's draw a close here.
No, we have to talk about what happens when citizens start an IGO.
Yes, but I want to get them to ask some questions.
No, we'll get some questions, but we've got to finish on the IGOs.
Okay.
So, the notion of becoming a one-man IGO, right? We've already got a great example of a one-man IGO.
IGO again.
International governmental organization,
Okay.
which is Satoshi Nakamura.
In creating a Bitcoin.
So, a man sitting in front of a computer makes the central bank of the internet, uploads it, a bunch of people voluntarily choose to adopt it. It acquires, at this point, a market cap of $4 billion, and it's a one-man software-based IGO startup.
Okay.
Right? So it hovers politely but far above democracy. Right? It's outside of the reach of the nation states. The nation states are kind of pawing after this thing, but you can't really catch it because it's floating above your level. The international organizations that might want to collaborate can't get hold of the bloody thing because it lives on the internet. It's entirely made of electrons. Right? It turns out that it's possible, if you're a particularly wicked kind of a citizen, to start a one-man IGO. Right? The problem is that Satoshi's one-man IGO, because of faults in the political engineering, turns out to manifest in the material world as an immediately identifiable phenomena, which is an enormous warehouse full of custom silicon doing Bitcoin mining.
Right.
So the vulnerability in Satoshi's one-man IGO is that you can physically identify these enormous mining operations by their megawatt power bills and huge physical footprint. Right? So the kind of infrastructure.
But that's always the case, that things that live on the internet have to interface with reality at some point.
Exactly.
And those portals can be at least policed or controlled.
What is the cloud? The cloud is a shed on the other side of the M4. Right. But we get through this Ethereum thing, right? This new job of mine.
Okay.
So Ethereum, has all the same properties of being an IGO. Right? The intention is for it to be a global computing infrastructure, which essentially allows individuals to combine their computers into a compute network, which will be substantially larger than Google. So vast supercomputer style level resources with an internal accounting system that allows you to figure out who's going to run your jobs and who isn't. And it does currencies and things as a side effect. So the critical piece of engineering at a political level, at a stacktivism level for Ethereum, is that it's designed, and we'll see whether they can follow through, so that the most efficient technology for running Ethereum is a laptop you've already paid for to run Photoshop.
Okay.
Right? Because if you get the engineering correct, rather than having a footprint which is a bunch of huge data warehouses, you have a footprint which is made of individuals on laptops who have no surface visible delta from other individuals on laptops.
Okay.
So you wind up with this thing which has all the functions of being essentially an IGO in the same league as the International Telecommunications Union, but has a physical footprint which is indistinguishable from ordinary citizenry. And I think that might be kind of a big deal.
Do you have faith in its ability to resist takeover and control?
Well, none of these technologies are permanent, right? You know, Bitcoin gave birth to 150 cryptocurrencies that were trivial forks. Number might be 600 now. Ethereum is one of a handful of things which are doing serious reanalysis on how to get that to work, right? How do we actually do something which is the thing you would build after Bitcoin, right? And there are a few people trying it, including the Bitcoin Foundation, who are trying to evolve Bitcoin into the next generation version of itself, right? None of these things are going to be final. My guess is we're going to have 40 or 50 years of people building things on top of things, on top of things, on top of things, until we finally get something which works as well as the market economy works. Right? But it's going to be generations of experimentation. The critical thing is this. If citizens can get together to start international governmental organizations without going through the nation state level, what if we could recapture some actual influence on the long-term development of global politics without having to go through the sclerotic form of four-year electoral democracy?
Something like liquid democracy of the pirate.
You could do liquid democracy. You can imagine a Green Party that organised without bothering with MPs, right? The idea that you could simply decide that you're going to form global political actors which are citizen-run, volunteer-led, have seats at the international table in exactly the same way that the other IGOs do, but are actually on behalf of the people, right?
Well, we've been very much indoctrinated against the idea that real populism would work because of this idea that everybody's going to vote for hanging tomorrow or something like that. I'm not talking about
populism, right? But think of Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Wikipedia's natural form is to be incorporated as an international governmental organization rather than a charity which is under US control.
Wikipedia is an interesting example because it's gradually developed a kind of inner elite that's become more and more autocratic.
That's absolutely fine, right?
Depends your perspective.
Look, creeping bureaucratization is the equivalent to calcification of bones in humans. It's what gives you enough force to stand up against gravity, right? An organization which never grows bureaucrats is like a human being that never grows bones. You need hard surfaces in your organization.
But it's bureaucrats that run the infrastructure that we're at a certain level criticizing in this conversation. It's bureaucrats that organize the roads, the water, all these different layers of infrastructure. Here, what we're missing is a concept of degree of sclerosis, let's say.
I think that the bureaucrats are okay as long as the bureaucrats are only being paid as bureaucrats. What makes the infrastructure dangerous is when you take the infrastructure and turn it into the same kind of cash vacuum that a casino is, right?
For example,
when you put investors behind the infrastructure who want to, for example, sack California by virtue of Enron, right?
That's the thing of when it's state infrastructure that is purely funded by the state versus infrastructure that gets handed over to private enterprise.
Well, and as you go further on the path of handing infrastructure to private enterprise, you get higher and higher and higher risk behaviors, so you get more and more and more sacking of room. Right? The reason I'm focused on the idea of IGOs is this, right? Civil society has no voice at the international level. Civil society only gets voice up to the level of the nation, and above that, there's just nothing.
There are organizations like Greenpeace and so on and so forth that have a voice beyond the nation state.
Yes, but they're largely incorporated as charities within nation states, and they have very little real footprint. So I think that we need to be pushing for two kinds of new legitimacy. I think organizations like Ethereum ought to have the potential to get registered as IGOs. Organizations like Wikipedia ought to have the potential to get registered as IGOs, right? And the notion that we would start seeing civil society building global political actors that were written into the international system in exactly the same way as the other IGOs are, seems to me to be a way that we could actually get a rebalancing of the political ecology of the world without having to break four-year electoral democracy to get there.
I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think organizations like ISO are written into the international legal system. They just exist. And I think in that sense, Wikipedia or Ethereum could equally just exist.
Right. So at that point, what I'm suggesting is this is a political strategy for the next generation's worth of facts. Right? I think we need to get things which are at least as autonomous as special economic zones and preferably countries, in which we can write building codes to the highest possible standard and do the ecological engineering by law. And I think that we need to start building citizen-led IGOs that represent interests like Wikipedia, Ethereum, Bitcoin, and so on, right? Because the only way that you can get a reasonable amount of protection for a pissed-off nation-state is a black passport.
Is a what?
A black passport, a diplomatic passport.
Okay.
And I think that people like Jimmy Wales should get diplomatic passports. If Satoshi Nakamoto could get a diplomatic passport for having started Bitcoin, right? You get a Nobel Prize and diplomatic passport. You are free to do what you like from here on in. Please don't abuse it.
Yeah, right? You have always this idealization of the great man. It's a very long story in intellectual history.
But how else are we going to punt people to the level where they can act on behalf of humanity without having to first become prime ministers?
I don't know, but
right?
Idealizations of great has a long history of problems.
Right? One-man IGO, we've already got one. Right? Ethereum, it's a small team. It's going to be a second. Right? And IGOs which exist without having an identifiable material base in the form of huge server farms are potentially extraordinarily resilient. So imagine if 10 years out, we have a global supercomputer network with its own resource provisioning mechanisms, which is run by an IGO whose job it is to keep that system running and resist, for example, intrusion by the NSA. This is the kind of political structure that might give ordinary humans, right, the mass of humanity, an actual voice at the table when the decisions are made about who starves and who feasts. I don't think we can get it done through electoral democracy anymore.
Okay, let's stop it here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinay. Do you have any questions?
Are we having fun?
No questions?
It was kind of interesting, the point you touched on about not being able to make any kind of social or political transition without protecting your key crucial infrastructure, crucial resources.
Yeah.
And you mentioned very briefly the Transition Towns movement that you were critical of that. Is the Transition Towns not focused quite strongly on things like food and energy that are critical infrastructure? Haven't they got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hard question. So there are two issues with transition towns. The first is that, actually, it's really only one problem. Transition Towns has nailed its colors to the massive thing called energy descent. And energy descent isn't going to happen, right? The development of solar technology is accelerating so quickly, the adoption is accelerating so quickly, that in all probability, we're going to go into a more or less long boom, at least 20 or 30 years boom, because the price of energy is going to be falling every year and the availability of clean energy is going to be going rapidly up. So one of the big German banks has just released a report saying that solar will be cheaper than grid power in all 50 states by 2016, right, American states. So by the time you've got the entire American electricity industry divesting from coal as fast as its little legs will carry it, the volume of production you do of solar panels becomes unbelievably enormous. They've been falling in price for 7% a year for 40 years already. So you suddenly step into this domain where, every time you need to invest in a new energy resource because your old one is finally knackered, right? Your coal-powered power station is being decommissioned. We need to go and finance a new power plant. Let's pay twice as much to build coal. It's just not going to happen, right? So what we're about to see is this unbelievably rapid decarbonization driven by the fact that solar is now just the cheap thing to do and capitalism is ruthless. Followed by energy prices drop year on year on year for the foreseeable future. Bloody hell, right?
Except in countries that illegalize solar panels.
Oh, let's not start that one. Spain has something absurd like a 30 million euro fine for off-grid energy generation without a license or something. I can't remember what it is. You've got to look it up, right? You just type anti-solar law into Google, and you'll get page after page after page after page of drooling insanity. Like, yeah, we're talking about 4 degrees of warming, but we're definitely going to pass some new laws against solar panels. Oh my God. They're really doing this. It's amazing.
It's not the only place, though, Spain.
No, it's not the only place. Hawaii, Kansas, Texas? Maybe not Texas.
Not Texas, no.
Texas. Get your goddamn hands off my solar panel. So, a lot of what Transition Towns is talking about in terms of relocalization, food systems, agriculture, communities, and all of this kind of stuff, I think all of that stuff is pretty much spot on, simply for quality of life and economic
I think that
resilience
raises a very
reasons.
important issue, because one of the things with agriculture is that as yet we are not in a position to replace industrial agriculture dependent on fertilizers and energy inputs, petroleum energy inputs, with purely electrical power. We may get there.
The electrical power isn't cheap enough yet.
We may get there, but we're not there yet.
It's not remotely cheap enough yet. I mean, can you even buy a lithium-ion battery tractor? Probably not yet.
They're about to do that.
I mean, on the other hand, I mean, ag is, I don't know, what, 3% or 5% of global energy consumption? Can't be that much.
In terms of environmental impact, though, it's much higher than that.
Yes, but in terms of the amount of energy you need to keep your tractors running, it's probably not that much.
I don't know, that's a good question. So, it's not just the tractors, though, it's the whole system, because it's also fertilizers.
Yeah, fertilizers
and things like that. And phosphorus has a 30-year window.
Yeah.
We're running out of phosphorus fast.
Fertilizer, I agree, is a really hard problem. I mean, but, so, I mean, if we get people's commuting and most of manufacturing onto solar, so solar cars, solar buses,
it will drop the price of petroleum.
Hang on, not just the price of petroleum, but solar cars, solar buses, solar manufacturing, solar office buildings, right? If we get that, that's going to cut our global fossil fuel use by something like 80%. Right?
Okay.
If tractors continue to run on diesel and planes continue to run on aviation fuel and trains continue to run on diesel, it's actually negligible in terms of contributions to climate.
But worldwide, most trains run on electricity.
Right. So, you know, you wind up with a much, much smaller footprint on that stuff because they're really big lumps, right? Transportation's about half of it, and transportation's about a third, industrial buildings are a third, homes are about a third. And most of that can be flipped onto solar fairly quickly.
Fair point.
So were you talking, well, you were talking about political change, right?
Yes.
And you spend a lot of time talking about the leaders, bureaucracy, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But historically, if we talk about Chile, Cuba, even Brazil, political change is usually based on changes in the society, driven by the society. Do you think that nowadays we have a society that is ready to make that change towards what you're talking about?
Well, you know, pick your country, right? And within your country, pick your demographic. Young people under the age of maybe 25 essentially live in conditions kind of like the former Soviet Union. They have no money, they have no jobs, they're packed into tiny little buildings with far too many people living there, they have no long-term economic prospects, and their qualifications are basically worthless. Right? They live in a completely different economic reality from the 50-year-olds who own houses, rent their spare rooms out for £800 a month, two people that could be their children. You know, they live in essentially two completely different countries: the country of the old and the country of the young. The young are ready for radical political change; the old are not. Right? Look at the global system. The rich white countries have no interest in radical political change. The poor brown countries really need things to get shifted pretty damn quickly, right? And we're in a position where an increasingly small group of rich old white people can trade something like 50% of the world's resources, and everybody else is scraping by the rest of it. So are we ready for political change? Yes, right? But, and this is the killer but, is we've no actual agreement about what the hell to do next, right? If I go to my friends and say, right, you're in charge of the world, write me the manifesto, tell me exactly what to do. Nobody has anything, right? I can give you a plan for 2 to 3 billion human beings. I have no idea what to do about the cities. Rural areas, villages, deserts, plains, jungles, you name it, any place where the people are growing their own food and eating their own food, I could give you a sort of 12-point political program to make that place a paradise. You come to the cities, not my department, I don't know, go ask somebody else. Right. So until we get a real discussion about how we're going to run the world, what the hell option do the young have? right? Until they've got a plan that they agree on, how can they have political change?
Well, they are just going to erupt again and again, and we're seeing that in many, many places.
But all that will happen is they'll erupt and they'll get beat down because they won't build anything while they're erupting. If you erupt and what you put in place is economically productive and then you protect it, you have a new society.
Yes, usually where you get revolutions with a lot of destruction, and then people try and put things together afterwards.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that won't happen, but we certainly don't have time for it. It sounds like bullshit.
That's a different matter whether we have time for it, but that's a likely outcome.
Ugh, God, it's bollocks.
Oscar, you wanted to
Awful
ask again. Carry
Yeah,
on.
but somehow that is very close to the problem with capitalism right now, right? There's a crash in capitalism, so we don't know what to do next.
That's right.
That's the problem. But regardless of that, now we have a society that is dependent on infrastructure. Actually, at the beginning, the society was driving the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's the other way around. We're a society that is driven by infrastructure.
Absolutely.
So that means that the society can be controlled somehow from the people that control the infrastructure.
Would I do a thing like that? Yeah, absolutely, right. So, Egypt, right, cut off the water to Suez, right? In Detroit, they cut off about half of the city for not paying its water bills. ISIS turned off the water to a couple of cities when they were attacking them. Turning off the water to places that you're attacking is turning into a really standard thing. A lot of people are doing it. Nationalization and then capitalization of the water sources in South America. Fighting against populations by controlling their water supplies turning into a tactic. The Irish have 100,000 person protests because they sold the national water utility to some bunch of capitalists who then wanted to put smart meters into all the Irish people's homes. And the Irish were like, "You're not putting that spy box in my house, no!" And off they are fighting. That was a Scottish accent. But they're just not having any. I'm Scottish. I'm allowed to have a Scottish accent. They're just not having any because if you're a reasonably informed person, right, when you see somebody taking control of your water supply, you understand they're going to kill you. Right?
Well,
but, right, again, what do we do about that? I absolutely agree with your analysis. Control of the critical infrastructure gives absolute power to the person holding the keys. Power grid, water grid, oil supply, food supply. What's the plan?
I think there we have to bring it to a close.
We do? No, we got another question or two. Sure. What's going to break? Am I going to miss my train? Is anybody going to die?
No, we're going to go to the pub.
All right. Let's go. No, let's give it another 5 minutes. Go on. Get to the bottom of the barrel.
I was going to continue at the pub, but yeah. On that thought, how about the whole kind of Earthship concept? This idea of autonomous living, where your sewage, food, water, energy is all under your control.
So
Is that not?
I think a society built of people that live that way would have a really good chance of political freedom for people, right? I mean, if you're getting the majority of your needs met from ecology rather than society, then you get a lot of freedom to make up your mind about how society is going to function, right?
Yeah.
So part of the reason that I'm very interested in rural areas as a place for doing political change is that the villages around the world where people are eating 80% of their diet is food that they grow themselves are people that could very easily get a bit of solar panels, a bit of mesh networks, a bit of water filters, and get quite a high standard of living. I mean, these are really, really good first world class services, while remaining remaining in a position of political autonomy because they are dependent on their land rather than their neighbours. So I think we could get billions of people into a position of high standard of living and political freedom and high levels of education off the back of technologies like mesh networks, and then to do the large-scale grunt, right? This is kind of why I've been pushing this decentralization in computing thing for a while, right? If you can operate the services that are currently done by somebody like Google, but without generating vast centralized data structures that you can then park a tank on, you can have resilient political systems that are run on decentralized networks. So you take something like Ethereum, you run Ethereum over mesh,
I completely like the idea. The problem is, historically, we don't really have any equivalent model. So when Rome collapsed, roads carried on functioning for a period of time locally.
Yeah.
But over a period of time, they disappeared. So by the time you get to the 6th, 7th century, the whole road infrastructure across Europe had disappeared.
Because it turns out the roads were economically productive for the empire, but not for the locals.
Why, though? In principle, trade was still occurring, people were still exchanging goods, there was a whole raison d'etre, and yet what's missing is the centralized control that actually says, we are going to build a road from here and there and maintain it.
Well,
that's
note that
the issue with the decentralized model.
Note that I say I have no plan for the cities. Right?
Yeah.
So the areas of high population density, you can't escape massive social complexity. I have no idea how to get massive social complexity that is more functional than what we have now. Ian Welsh, at iWelsh on Twitter, Ian Welsh will give you 50 pages of chapter and verse on how to get high complexity societies that work properly, largely by correctly managing monopolies and monopolies and tax bases. Right?
Okay, so
and it's very politically sophisticated. I have no idea whether it would work or not, right? But there are people thinking about how to do that stuff. I am largely confined to thinking about the villages because I only really do simple systems, right? Subtle and simple, high complexity stuff. I don't know. Poke it with a stick. Tell me what happened.
Couldn't you build an Earthship in a city
No.
then?
An Earthship is basically a machine for capturing ecosystem services, sunlight for heat, tons of mass, water, and all the rest of these things. In a city, if you're going to have people living in, say, a 4-story building, you can't do a 4-story Earthship because it just doesn't have enough surface area to catch all your energy from. Right? You can do super insulated buildings that are minimally dependent. You can do your rainwater collection and all the rest of those things. You can get pretty close, but the complete closing of the loops, I think, requires a substantial amount of land around you, if only for sewage leaching. But you can get close, right? And in the suburbs, right? In suburbs, you could probably do an Earthship, but not high density stuff like Manhattan density. I think you have to go to something different. Right, final points, and then shall we wrap up and go to the pub? So the reason that it matters, right? You take a little glitch in your algorithm. The glitch in the algorithm produces huge centralized data centers, which are super easy targets.
Well, I think that's historically, whether it's software or whether it's other types of infrastructure, it's always been that way.
Right. So something like Google, if Google made a stand against the NSA and said, right, we've had enough of this crap, Google would have real problems because people would come around to their server centers, bolt cutters, and turn off the power. Right? Gone. The notion that you need a decentralized network to have politically unpopular speech is absolutely key to our ability to keep global civil society running. Right? I'm completely convinced that chewing our way through 4-year electoral democracy to elect radical candidates with big ideas is going to take such a long time that global warming will be a done deal by the time it's achieved. But the notion of building international organizations which have global support, that are broadly representative, that have humanitarian goals, that these things largely exist online using decentralized platforms like Ethereum to provide them with truly resilient continuity of computing, right? You can't turn off somebody's voice by shutting down their server because their server is everyone's server. That is the network that could potentially provide safe, anonymous, global, secure political speech for people that actually want to change things. And solving the free speech crisis, I think, is the first step, right? Internationalism, globalism, free speech crisis, decentralized networks, so you've got real resilience. The possibility is that we could simply accept that 4-year electoral democracy is how we run nation states, but the actual domain of how we struggle for political control of the world against the incumbent powers is wide open as long as we build our own infrastructure platforms.
The question there, though, and that remains an issue, is how these new international organizations that you're imagining are actually going to have leverage upon the physical world. Wikipedia can do all kinds of things with its knowledge, with its documents and so on. how does it actually change politics?
And the answer to that has to be that once you know the history and once you know what your options are, you begin to behave differently. If people download software that causes them to become part of a political unit that didn't previously exist, that's a step. Right? If people learn crop rotation or how to treat potato weevils from the internet, that's a step. You know, when we think about what will happen when the internet really begins to change developing world economies at the village level, you know, I bet
That's already happening.
right? And that's only the first step of that. By the time you've got kids that got PhD level education without ever leaving their villages, I think you're going to see such a transformation in the economic conditions without necessarily having more resource consumption. You know, Jeffersonian democracy in the villages protected by global networks.
I hope so.
Quite try. Because if it's not that, it's going to be genocide of the rich.
Vinay, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.